Everyone understands that we are living through precarious times. These are challenging times. These are times where we have to be aware of what is happening in the world at many different levels. Very importantly, as part of this, our financial well-being as individuals, as families, communities, even nations, even the world. Now is the time to be looking at financial doom, to understand it, not to live in fear, not to worry too much, but instead to understand how to prepare. That's what this is about, not to spread fear, not to put you in a position of uncertainty or greater uncertainty than you already are, but instead to enlighten and understand so that you can be prepared and really enjoy the future instead of worrying too much. So we begin. The United States, for all intents and purposes, is an empire, like many empires of the past. And like all empires, we see an increase in power, sort of a leveling off of power, and then perhaps a decline in power. Again, the United States is very much an empire. What does that mean? Well, we can look at what Ray Dalio has put together. If you're not aware of who Ray Dalio is, he is a multi-billionaire. He is very much embedded in the markets. He is the founder of Bridgewater. And very importantly, he has put together several writings and he has written a few books. This is one of his most popular, The Changing World Order. And you'll notice that there are principles for dealing with the changing world order. So this is not simply just understanding how the world is changing, because the world is always changing, but instead, how do we deal with that change as it's happening and as we are living through it? Also importantly is, again, considering that the US is an empire, well, why do nations succeed and fail? Obviously, that's going to relate to you depending on whether you're inside the US or you're outside the US. But regardless, nations succeeding and failing can really cause great harm to you financially, or they can enrich you. This all depends on your positioning and your reaction to the changes that are happening. One of the things I want to point out is that Ray Dalio has issued many different articles and reports. He's also even put together videos that explain his thinking. You're able to see it and understand it. So the changing world order, that particular idea has been captured not only in books and articles, but also a video, and it's easy to find through a couple of quick searches. And again, we are dealing with the change. Again, Ray Dalio here. Let's dive into specific pieces and parts for how to handle this. I really like this. It is about the 8 key measurements of a country's strength. There are really multiple strengths. We can look at these 8, and they are somewhat subjective, but there's enough objectivity and enough sort of quantitative awareness where we can look at one nation versus another. And the 8 are education, technology, competitiveness, economic output, world trade, military strength, financial centers, and reserve currency. Now, if you sort of stop and think about these are very macroeconomic factors versus sort of the microeconomic factors. These are the broad, overarching sort of umbrella measurements of strength. So think very big picture. If you want to look at a country or a nation, it obviously makes sense to look at the highest level and kind of look on down, the proverbial bird's eye view. Education obviously is about your citizens, and technology is just really how technologically advanced you are, competitiveness, and that's, a matter of efficiency, for example, many other measurements there within competitiveness. Economic output, do the citizens actually produce, or are they more sort of consumer oriented? World trade, or are they, basically, are you doing industry and are you doing trade within the nation's borders, or are you a global power where you have many trading partners and agreements and so on and so forth, and the law is there so that the actual commerce can take place? Military strength, can you protect what you've got? Can you project your power, and so on? Financial centers, is money flowing, right? The lifeblood of a nation in many senses is the money that flows in and out of it, just like your circulatory system and reserve currency. In other words, can you control the money? Can you turn on and turn off the money printer? Can you turn on and turn off, or really crank up or crank down interest rates easily with the currency in mind, and so on? Sort of economic power there. So this really is very powerful. It's worth understanding, again, at the highest level. Now, if we do look at empires, remembering that at least the United States is an empire, but we can think of other previous empires as well, as you can see how they wax and wane, right? Just like the moon. You have these phases that different countries and nations go through over time. And this is a nice visualization. Now, the two colors that probably ought to be focused on here, and they should stand out to a degree, is you do have maybe even three. Let's say three. You've got the United Kingdom in black, and you can see how they were very powerful on the uprise for many hundreds of years, and then they started to drop off precipitously. You can also see during the rise of the United Kingdom, you also had the United States rising in power and then surpassing the United Kingdom as well. But the US has started to decline. You can see the decline in power. Again, this is a relative standing versus all other countries. So it's one country versus all others, another country against all others, and so on. So relative standing of these empires. Okay, so back on track here, and also you can see how China sort of degraded over time, and then it's been shooting up, and there's a lot of power there, a lot of control, a lot of money, a lot of commerce with the Chinese empire. So perhaps the US is declining, perhaps China is radically increasing at the exact same time. And of course, this causes a great deal of friction. Everything that we have seen before in the earlier part of the training. This includes military friction, financial friction, commerce and trade friction, and then there are some other areas of friction as well. You can refer to the earlier part of the training for that to see and kind of think through for yourself how this friction manifests itself. But this does help you understand that we work through cycles over time. Another thing that's really great about this particular visualization is that you can see the major wars over time, because war and military action has a great impact on the strength and size, growth, decline, and so forth of each nation. It can help some countries, obviously, and it can cause great harm to other countries at the exact same time. So this is worth taking a look at. Now, interestingly, before we move on, you'll see that relatively speaking, there has not been much in the way of truly major wars in the very recent past. But it is ominous to see just how many wars and military conflicts there have been over the last many hundreds of years. So it's sort of almost inevitable that something is going to be happening at some point in the future where there's a major military conflict. Another way to visualize this and to truly understand how empires start, or a new order begins, let's call it that, per the visualization here. You have the new order or the new nation. You can see that there is a rise, the top, and the decline, and then another new order comes into being. Now, I'm not going to spend the time, because you can reference this yourself, to go through 1 all the way through 18. What's more important is, in the context of the United States in particular, that's sort of our case study, and what many people are living through right now is sort of the nation of the United States and the power that it has, sort of in conflict with a rising power of China. It's a very easy way to understand the rise, the top, and the decline of these nations. But we really want to focus most on the decline. And that is because if we think in reference to the United States, we see these things right now in our daily lives starting to manifest. So rather than being at this highest level, we're actually experiencing boots on the ground in the real world, in the here and now, many of these things playing out in our day-to-day lives. So we see debt, the excess money printing, we see internal conflict, we see a lot of issues at the sort of civil level, us versus them, the black and white thinking, the different tribes that are coming about. Also, the loss of reserve currency, so the money getting weaker for a variety of reasons. Also, weak leadership. You see some populism, you see various high-level leaders who don't seem to have a spine, or if they do have a spine, their interests are very personal in some cases, or they're very narrow and one-sided, and therefore that is weak leadership. And this is not to say that one party or another is right or better. It's not to say that. It's instead to say that leadership itself is lacking and therefore not unifying the particular country or the nation. We also have an issue of centralization of power in other countries, with China being a great example, where you have fewer and fewer choices and opportunities to, in effect, align with different ideals and different principles that you might have. So it's very interesting that we see some fragmentation with some nations, for example, the United States, and you see a consolidation of even more power in certain areas and certain aspects of the United States, but you definitely see that politically with China, and take that for what you will. And then, of course, civil war and revolution very often being an end result for these various internal conflicts and external conflicts. There are obviously both, and when they're happening at the same time, you're bound to have some very, very real issues at many different levels. But this decline is what appears is happening right now, possibly with the United States, or at least that is the thesis of Ray Dalio and what we're experiencing with a changing world order. Now, at this point, it's worthwhile to look at in greater detail the decline. So let's spend some time looking at each of these. So large debts, you'll see an accumulation of significant public debt, sometimes private as well, but definitely public debt. And that is in large part due to excessive spending and borrowing by the government. Increased interest payments. So the debt is harder and harder to pay off with higher interest payments, no matter what's happening with the actual interest rates, because the debt is growing. Naturally, the interest payments have to grow regardless. And there's reduced financial flexibility. This is across really the entire nation, but specifically in the public sector, and the government ends up being hamstrung. We also have potential credit downgrades, or actual downgrades, and that makes it harder to borrow and service existing debts. Again, this is across the entire country, the entire nation, the entire empire, but in particular, larger and larger debt loads that the government is facing. Moving on to money printing, the idea here is that basically the reserve currency is at risk further and further as more and more dollars flood the system, but there is not a commensurate increase in the output. This means we have an over-reliance on the printing of money to meet the financial obligations, and that's in contrast to an increase in actual value and production of that nation, of that country, so that the government is, in effect, not on the hook to make the nation stronger and more powerful. Private enterprise, in other words, is squeezed out as the public enterprise, in this case, the Federal Reserve, takes on more and more debt and prints more money to take care of the obligations. This also leads to inflationary pressures, which erode purchasing power and undermine economic stability. So you have higher highs, which you should not have, and you have lower lows. And in effect, booms and busts are exacerbated by the money printing. There's also a loss of confidence, and I'd say trust, in the currency itself by both domestic and, importantly, international markets. So you can see that money printing has many, many side effects. As I've already discussed here, internal conflict, but also external conflict. If we look inside the nation in particular, there are deep-rooted social, political, and ethnic divisions amongst others, leading to internal strife and issues. We've all seen this. For those people in the United States, there's one thing after another where this group is after that group, and that group is after this other group, and so on. Lather, rinse, repeat, one group after another. That also leads to general instability. This can be lawful stability, this can be interpersonal stability, this can be the nation versus the states versus the individual cities and such, right? So it's at different levels, horizontal and vertical conflict, and also instability. Violence increasing, reduced productivity, and this is all due to conflicts and general civil unrest. Also, we have a weakening of centralized authority in a sense where there's less trust and belief in the government. At the same time, the government very often is trying to crack down and increase its control. For example, we've probably mostly all heard about the increase in surveillance and oversight of day-to-day activities. This centralization increases while the actual trust in the central authority decreases. Therefore, we have the weakening of that central authority. At the same time, it's grabbing for more and more power. This really erodes the power of the government at multiple levels if it's not handled appropriately. The idea of the loss of reserve currency, this is something of a decline. This is a reduction in the power of the currency, which is a very powerful tool for the nation, especially if you are the reserve currency of the world, like the US dollar still at this point. So much trade and so many transactions are literally done in US dollars, and they must be done in US dollars for a variety of reasons, including contracts that are in place within the United States, but also outside the United States. Without any US intervention, this trade is being done because it's the reserve currency. So the decline of the empire's currency as a global reserve or a global asset is put into jeopardy. That obviously decreases the power of the empire itself. There's also reduced demand for the currency itself, which is in effect treated as an asset. Okay, that's for the currency itself, and that's an international transaction. As that reduces, as it declines over time, the actual power and the ability to project that power around the world does decrease. There's also diminished influence over global financial and economic affairs for a variety of reasons. You just do not have the ability to use money itself as a matter of leverage or a tool or even outright weaponry, right? And the money can be used that way, and we have seen that in the recent past. Leadership becoming weaker and weaker over time, even as it tries to tighten its grip. This is a matter of ineffective governance. We also can see greater amounts of corruption. Also lack of vision happening in the later stages. There's an inability also to address pressing current economic, social, and political challenges. So that declines over time as the leadership also is not strong enough to handle the challenges of the day. And as you know, there is a loss of public trust in the government, certainly as a result of not having the trust and believing enough in the leadership itself. This erodes the confidence of the citizens. This erodes confidence within the nation, within the empire itself, but also outside as well. So those countries that look at the United States, again, as the example, that confidence is decreased as well. So global power declines as leadership also declines in power. And these institutions that are associated with that particular country also lose power because the top end government leadership is weak. That also spills over into the private corporations, for example, which have less leverage to deal with various business problems that they face. Well, are there fixes? Are there things that you can do to protect yourself? Well, let's take a look at what can be done. Certainly education and awareness, which is part of what you're experiencing at this point in time. Being aware is possibly even half the battle. Seeking to understand these underlying causes and the dynamics of economic and political issues is definitely one of the very first steps you can be taking. You can stay informed about current events that matter and also global trends, these macro trends that may impact the situation for the empire, but very practically also trends that may impact you in the here and now. For example, possible jobs, possible business opportunities, possible investments. Again, these things may or may not make sense to you at this point in time, but as you increase your education and awareness, you can be more savvy, more nimble, and take care of yourself, your family, and perhaps even your community, state, and the nation as a whole. So this is of tremendous importance. There's also a certain amount of personal financial responsibility that you can take as your awareness grows. You can take certain steps to manage your personal finances, prudently. And you can do things like saving and budgeting and avoiding excessive debt. That doesn't mean you have to completely get out of debt, but there are certain kinds of debt that will cause you more harm and more pain, and there are others that perhaps would be far, far more advantageous to you. You can also do some simple things such as diversifying your investments to handle the radical changes that are happening in uncertain times and uncertain areas of your own personal life. You can consider better long-term financial goals if you know what those goals are, and then you can align your diversification with those financial goals. Civic engagement. Now, what this means is really being involved, participate in the democratic process itself, get involved first, perhaps locally. That can be very effective, and hold leaders accountable regardless through voting and activism that align with the highest principles of the nation all the way down to your personal household and really for you as an individual. You can do that through voting, activism, and sharing education and sharing your knowledge with others in a very like-minded, success-oriented way, orienting toward a better future in effect, and being somewhat realistic and somewhat optimistic at the same time. You can engage in constructive dialogue with people, understand where they are coming from, explain your point of view. You can be objective, but you can also work to persuade other people so that they can work toward a greater good along with you. You can support organizations that are working toward positive change. You can build your community. Obviously, the first and smartest thing is within your own individual environment. That can be you as an individual or possibly your family. And you can immediately be working with the community, fostering strong local communities and networks, again, of like-minded, success-oriented people, people who have a greater vision of a more positive future, so that the empire maintains itself, if that's what you wish, or you can adjust the direction of the empire for the greater good and perhaps even the good of the world. Another thing is promoting cooperation, empathy, mutually supporting others within communities. This can be very, very effective to the benefit of all. You can also be an advocate of structural reforms. Know what you want and why you want it at all these different levels. Again, education is key, understanding and awareness are essential. You can support policies and reforms that address underlying economic, social, and political issues. This is necessary because it's not just the economy, just the ills of society, or even politics. It is a multifaceted situation, multifaceted problem to be faced. That's the challenge that we face. You can encourage responsible fiscal and monetary policies to the best of your ability. You can increase transparency and demand greater transparency. And obviously that means effective governance as well. That ends that training, and we shall see you in the next one.